about with the people back in Russia?
I'll start back with the Ifshins in Russia. My grandfather, his name was Kalman Ifshin. And I believe my father's maiden name, I don't know why, I think the name
Your father didn't have a maiden name.
My father's mother's maiden name. I think her name was Glazer. I am not positive, but I remember hearing my father talk about his cousins, the Glazers in California. My father's mother's name was Minna, and they lived in Homya in Russia, which was, I suppose, a suburb or a shtetl outside of Gomel.
G-O-M-E-L.
G-O-M-E-L. And they were probably the richest Jewish family in the town. My grandfather was a very charitable man. And I can remember my father relating tales that when the Sabbath came on Friday night, my grandfather would go to shul, and there were always 30 strangers, at least 30 strangers who came to dinner. All the strangers in town were invited to my grandparents' house for Shabbat dinner, and they would serve dinner there. And my father says he always sat at the foot of the table, my grandfather at the head of the table, and he used to love the head of the gefilte fish, but he was not allowed to ask for anything because he was a child and he had to be seen in that herd. So he would point to his head like this, and his mother would nod her head, and he would get the piece, the head of the gefilte fish, which he adored. Whenever an orphan girl or a very poor girl had to be married and did not have a dowry, my grandfather would supply a dowry for her, and they would have the wedding in their house on Sabbath Eve, on Friday night, Friday afternoon, in their house. They had the weddings for all the girls. And my father said they always bought everything by the barrelful, which I guess was the way they did it then. Barrels of herring and barrels of nuts and barrels of everything you could think of, potatoes and everything else. And they had it, had it all in the cellar underneath the house. My father had the oldest member of my father's family was his sister, whose name was Vasha, who was the most dominating and domineering woman I know.
Becky.
Tante Becky. And he had a brother after that, Willie, and then my father, Meir Leib, and then he had 3 brothers younger than he, and the youngest one of the family was Aunt Miriam Marinoff. The 3 brothers who were younger than he was remained in Russia. They wouldn't come to this country. And I understand one was killed during the Second World War. Another one was lost a leg or an arm, and that man's son lost either reverse. One of them lost a leg and the other an arm. And we have a number of first cousins who still live there. I saw a picture of one who looked very much like a cousin here. His name was Lena. Lena Binder. Lena Binder was Tante Becky's oldest daughter. When my Tante Becky was being courted by her husband, his name was Aaron Binder. Huh?
There was one other member you forgot, the family you forgot the name.
Who?
Moshe Morris.
He was a first cousin.
He was a first cousin, but he was brought up by our grandmother.
That's right. He was
so
orphaned.
He was considered as members of the family.
Yeah, that's right. Morris Ifshin,
He
who lived in Florida. That's right. At any rate, with my aunt, I'm trying to think of the funny stories that were told. When my Aunt Becky was being courted by her husband, who was a doll, he was a lovely man. He was from, I think, Vilna in Lithuania, and he loved herring. So he'd go down in the cold basement of the house, and they always knew when he was courting her because they find, my father always used to kid him, they find the herring bones from the head, the bone, and the tail there. My uncle would eat the whole herring right off the bone. He liked herring that much. And my uncle Binder, we used to call him Uncle Binder, and my Tante Becky had 4 daughters. Lena, who married Manny Kasawa, Sadie, who married Fred Zeitz, Anna, who married Charlie Rosenmertz, and Marjorie, who married Bernie. What's their last name? I can't think of it now.
What did Grandpa's father do?
Trucking business.
He was a trucker.
Horse and wagon.
Teamster.
Teamster. He was in Teamsters. And I know after the war, after the revolution in Russia, all of his property was taken away from him, and he lived with a servant. One of the servants in the house had a little house, and he lived in a corner of the room of that house. He had no place to go after. Well, he died a very poor man and a sick man.
When did the children start coming to the United States?
Grandpa came in 1905.
He came after 1905 because he was shot during the 1905 pogrom.
You always
And
told me it was 1905.
Well, they must have come right after because he always had a scar. I don't remember, his right hand, I think it was his right hand,
Right hand.
where he was hit with a bullet, went right through the palm of his hand, and you could always see the scar. He carried that scar with him all the rest of his life. He was lucky because somebody saw the Kazakhs coming down the street. They pulled him into a doorway, and in pulling him in, his hand went shut out, and that's where he was hit. Otherwise, he would have been killed. At that time, my Uncle Willie, who was a revolutionary, was sent to America, and he was engaged to his wife, who was Tanta Gussie, who was then to be his wife. So my father married her. It was a proxy marriage. It was a proxy wedding. My father was a proxy, and he, who was considerably younger than Tanta Gussie, escorted her to America on board a ship, and he brought her to America where she joined Uncle Willie.
He was 15 years old, I think.
He was about 14 years old when he came here.
How old was she?
I don't know.
She was older.
She was older than he.
17.
Maybe
older woman.
17. At any rate, Uncle Willie and Tanta Gussie had 4 children. The oldest one was Danny Ifshin. Then came Lee, and then Mo, and the youngest one was Sidney.
You forgot one tidbit in there. Tanta Gussie's sister
Oh yeah,
was married to my father's uncle.
his father's brother,
His father's brother. So 2 sisters were married to the uncle and to the
nephew.
nephew.
For the son. Well, the Tanta Gussie's sister's name was Manya, and she was married to my father's uncle, whose name was Isidore. They were very prolific. They had a lot of kids.
7.
They had 7 kids: Mary, Carl, Morris, Anne, Helen, Rose, Lily.
That's 7, though.
That's it.
Nathan Jr.
The youngest was
Jan, yeah.
the youngest was Helen.
Helen.
Yeah, and the only one who had a college education was Mary, who was an accountant. And the only reason she had a college education is she wanted to be educated, and she went to high school and college at night because her mother didn't believe in education. When the children graduated from grade school, that was enough education. Off to work you go, and give the money to her. Every one of them who graduated from high school went to night school. Interestingly enough, their children.
Did you say Sydney?
Sidney, didn't I say Sidney? Stumpy,
Stumpy.
who never went beyond grade school. I don't know if he went to high school. Stumpy became the millionaire of the family. He became a plumber and literally became a millionaire.
Couldn't find a job.
Couldn't
do anything. They got him a job as a plumber's helper, and he ended up a millionaire.
Where do they live?
In Brooklyn.
Is this Katie's
Everybody lived
father?
in Brooklyn, huh?
Is this Katie's father?
No,
No.
that's Sidney. That's Sidney.
Stumpy.
That's Uncle Willie's son. This is Uncle Izzy's son,
How many
Stumpy.
Sidney Ifshins are there in this world?
4 that I know of. I found out about it in a very funny way. It's very funny.
I used to see Stumpy, and they say, "Hi, Stumpy." He says, "It's not Stumpy anymore, it's Sydney."
Sidney,
I'm a millionaire.
he never washed his neck, and every time you saw him, he had sawed-off nails, and they were always black rimmed. Always looked as if his fingers were in mourning.
And he
He
had
was
a
a
funny
nice guy.
laugh, right?
But plenty of money.
That's
He
a nice
fooled
money.
everybody. But at any rate, his nieces and nephews all were very brilliant. A number of them graduated from prestigious colleges where they attended on scholarships. So don't put them down. It was that they didn't have the other parents didn't have the opportunity for an education, but their children did, and they did very, very well.
May I ask a question to backtrack? Do you know anything about the passage over by boat in 1905?
No.
Nothing.
Came over
Nothing.
steerage.
They came in steerage like they all came.
They all came.
You know, there was nothing.
He came. His
Oh, I do know one thing.
when he
yeah.
came, his uncle Izzy was here, and his brother Willie was there.
Willie, yeah.
Who, by the way, you talk about a rubber.
Oh, at that time, Uncle Bint and Tante Becky were here too. Yeah.
But you talk about Uncle Willie being a revolutionary. This was a pussycat. The sweetest guy, really. The
But he was
sweetest,
a revolutionary. He
sweetest
became
man
a
in the
very
world.
religious man.
and
eventually.
he wouldn't hurt a fly. But
He was a socialist. When he came to this country, he always went to synagogue. He was only one of the family that I know who went to synagogue every Saturday. My
Anyway.
father never would go.
Anyway, my father became an apprentice roofer. That was his tinsmith. He wasn't the one who put the roof on. He was the one who worked with the sheet metal. He was a sheet metal worker. That's what they called him. And he became a master sheet metal worker. Then he became a foreman in the shop. He was in the Black Tom explosion, right?
During World War II, he worked.
World War One.
World War One, he worked in Tom's River, New Jersey.
And they had the explosion there where a lot of people were killed. And
Did he go to school?
No, no, he didn't. He taught himself
he went to
English.
school over there, but he taught himself
Well,
English.
in Russia, he went to school. He was going to what was the equivalent of high school when he.
What age was he when he came over in 1905?
14, she says.
14.
14, 15, right.
You know, they never kept track of their age.
He eventually went into business with his uncle, Izzy. And they called it Ifshin Brothers Roofing Company, but they weren't brothers. It was uncle and nephew.
Uncle and nephew.
And they did very well. They were a
did
good
very
team, and they did very well. But Depression came, and they were left holding a whole stack of notes that the builders owed them.
It was before the Depression. It was in 1928. I remember his once talking to somebody. I heard it, and he was telling this person. He says, "This was 1928, before the Depression hit." He says, "I was left enough notes by this man to wallpaper a whole house or a room. I don't remember, but that's how much money was owed to them." And we suffered very badly after the.
I remember that. He took it out one day, and I happened to be in a room with the Schiffer over here. He took out it was $250,000 in those days, which was
do you know what
millions
it
of dollars
Wow.
in today's thing. And he went under. That's
It
what
was,
caused.
you know, it was
And
very
there was a
sad.
struggle from there on.
It was rough. From there on until we moved to Washington, it was very rough. I remember when I graduated from junior high school. Strange, I was just telling it to Beverly and Leslie the other day. I graduated from junior high school in the morning. We had a morning ceremony. And in the evening, my sister graduated from high school the very same day. And my mother bought a dress for me so I wouldn't be embarrassed when I went to graduation. I'd have a pretty dress to wear. She paid $4 for that dress at Klein's on the square on 14th Street. Couldn't afford any more than that. So that I wouldn't be embarrassed to go to my junior high school graduation. And I remember at that time, the thing for parents to do, they always bought their child a ring to commemorate the occasion. When my sister graduated from grade school, they bought her a beautiful onyx ring with a diamond in it. And when I graduated from junior high school, they didn't have any money, and I was crying because I didn't have anything. And my mother and father were so hurt. I can still remember hearing, my father walk into the bedroom and call the jeweler that he had bought, who was a friend of theirs, from whom he had bought the ring for my sister, to ask him if he could buy a ring for me, and he'd pay him back whenever he had the money. And the man said no. And I cried, and they cried. It was a pretty sad day. Anyway.
Now, what was your address in New York?
Well,
2166
69th Street, Brooklyn, and that's
285 Avenue P.
after that. At any rate,
Oh my God.
the night I
Wait a
graduated
minute, wait, you
from-
didn't make yourself very clear.
when I graduated, the day I graduated from junior high, my sister graduated from high school. That day we had nothing to eat at home. We had soup because my mother had spent some money to buy me a dress. So the happy occasion turned into a...
Did Mildred get a new dress too?
No, Mildred wore an old dress that she had. She didn't get a new dress. I didn't have a dress. I was growing then.
Even though you were the middle child, you had a new
And even
dress.
though I was a middle child, I had the new dress. Mildred
Right,
didn't.
but,
Mildred had a beautiful sheer dress that she had gotten, I don't know, probably also in Klein's. And she was dating Sam at that time, so my sister was pretty well dressed. I didn't have a dress to wear. I just didn't have anything. What I had was hand-me-downs from Mildred. So that was my new dress, which was quite a thing for me because I didn't get new dresses. I got hand-me-downs.
I thought I wanted Uncle Harold wear your hand-me-down.
Yeah, that was really, yeah.
Uncle Hal, well, don't forget, I'm the middle child, so I didn't have the dresses, he had
I
the
didn't give it. I
pants.
was so busy playing boy, clothes didn't mean a damn thing.
He didn't
to
mean
me.
a damn thing to, it didn't mean a damn
But-
thing
but
to him.
that's-
I ruined more clothes than I wore for Christ's sake.
What
At
about,
any rate.
what about Grandma's family?
Okay.
My mother came from the Dworkins. My mother's name was Rose Dworkin. Her name was Rachel Dworkin. Her father's name was Wolfe, William Dworkin. Her mother's name was Vasha Hankin. She was a Hankin. And there were a lot of Hankins on my grandmother's side of the family. My grandmother was orphaned when she was 10, not orphaned, her mother died when she was 10, and she was the oldest child. And her father sent her to work in a shank, a bar, and she always had little spots in front of her eyes, she told me. And she said the reason she had those spots in front of her eyes was because when she worked in that bar, a cork popped off a bottle of liquor and hit her in the eye. And after that, she saw spots in front of her eye all the time. She was a very sweet woman. She was a very nice woman. She was tiny. She was about 5 feet tall.
Your grandmother?
My grandmother, my mother's mother.
And your mother's family all came to the United States around the turn of the century?
They came in 1906.
They came as a group.
They came, no, they didn't come as a group, no. My grandfather came from a very interesting family, and I'm going to have to find out what his mother's name is. My grandfather's mother was a midwife in the town of Vieques, from where they came. Vieques was not far from Pommier, where my father lived, but it was far enough so that people couldn't go there, I guess, unless they had a ride of some kind, which probably took God knows how long. My grandmother was the midwife in that town. She was a widow and a very, very poor woman. My grandfather's mother, my great-grandmother was a midwife. Every child in that town was delivered into this world by her, and she was very much loved. And my mother told me when Purim would come, her grandmother would get dressed in her best clothes, and she had a chest where she kept her clothes. They didn't have closets then, it was like a hope chest. And she would cover that chest with a white tablecloth, and my mother said she would sit there like a queen, and all the children in the town would come to bring her shalach manas. And she'd sit there and thank them. Some would bring her an orange, which was a precious thing to give at that time of the year. In Europe, they didn't have it. Cakes. They'd bring a kopek, which was a penny. And they'd leave it all on the table, and my great-grandmother would thank them for it very nicely. And then she'd call my mother, who was her oldest grandchild, and she'd say, Rochele, now you take this orange and bring it to this person who is very sick. Take the kopeks and give it to somebody else who doesn't have any money. And none of the shalach manas would remain. My great-grandmother would distribute all the money to the poor people in town. And my mother said she would drool. She wanted to taste the orange so badly, but she never got it because her great-grandmother said they had more to eat than the others. And my mother said it was a typical Jewish house where you carried a chicken into the house who was sick. And my mother said she can remember once they had a bone with meat on it, and they made soup with it. And she stood there and she drooled meat. She wanted a piece of it so badly. She wanted to taste it so badly. So they gave her a little string of beef, and they let her eat that. She said it was the best thing she ever ate. It was like manna from heaven. Well, when my great-grandmother died in this little town, they lit candles for her. Everybody in the town lit memorial candles for her, and they burned in the shul for 30 days. It was really a beautiful tribute.
This was Grandma's grandmother?
No, this was my grandfather's mother.
Oh, so it was Grandma's, okay, so it's your great-great-grandmother.
No, it was my great-great-grandmother. My grandmother was my mother's, my great-grandmother was my mother, my grandmother, and this is her mother-in-law, so it's my great-grandmother.
Okay.
It was Grandma's grandmother.
I need a picture.
Yeah, well, I'll draw it for you. At any rate,
Do you know what her name was?
I don't remember. I know what to call to get the name. I'm going to call Harry Dobkin knows because she brought him into the world. At any rate, when my grandfather came to America, he saved up enough money, and 2 years later, my grandmother came with her 3 remaining children. My grandmother had 4 children. My mother was the oldest, then my Aunt Eva, for whom I'm named, then a son who died at the age of 4 from diphtheria, and Aunt Edna, who was the baby of the family. When they came to America, you didn't know my mother had a brother yet. When they came to America, they were stolen across the border. They couldn't come legally.
Which border?
They was the German border. They left from Hamburg.
Right.
And what they did is they had enough people on the wagon. They had just enough room for so many people on the wagon, so they took Grandma, Aunt Eva, and Aunt Edna. And they said Grandma, who was 12 years old at that time, was old enough to go by herself. And they made her walk with the older people. And my mother knew she would never see her mother and her sisters again. She was scared out of her wits. But they made it through, and when she got to Hamburg, she found her mother and her sisters, and she says, what a reunion.
But
and
she
so
said she would never forgive her mother for that, too.
she was really, she never would forgive her mother. On top of it all, she resented the fact that her father had left them 2 years before and left them behind, so she was never going to forgive him. She was furious with him for having done this to them. She didn't understand what was going on. She had no concept. And they came to America. They came by way of steerage on the Amsterdam was the name of the boat. Grandma told me that, the Amsterdam.
You know what
It was
year?
the Rotterdam.
Was it the Rotterdam?
I think so.
The name, I think
Whatever
it was the
Rotterdam,
Rotterdam.
yeah.
You know
Maybe
what year it
Rotterdam.
was?
1906.
Yeah, she said, by the way, that she always hated the German Jews because of the way they treated them.
Really?
Yeah,
Couldn't stand
terrible.
German Jews.
She hated them. How?
What did they
To the
do?
day she died, I think she hated
They
them.
looked down upon her, very arrogant, looked down upon them like they were dirt.
You mean when they were in Germany?
Right, came through Germany. They
Yeah.
didn't do
Oh,
anything to help them
They
or
wouldn't-
anything.
they would consider them dirty people.
Well, there were serious pogroms going on at that time. in
Yes,
Russia.
they were.
Yeah, in Russia, I don't know what I'm talking about.
No, but I mean, there must have been a flood of immigrants through.
Oh, yeah.
Being
1905 and
smuggled through
1906, a
Germany.
tremendous
That's right,
number
but
of Jews.
what the German Jews thought of these people coming through was that
They didn't want to have anything to do with them. They wouldn't help them.
How much time did they spend in Germany?
Not
Not
long.
too-
Not too long. Very, seemed like days. I don't know. It wasn't very
So
long.
they came over on the Rotterdam.
And they came to the States, and my grandfather met them at the ship. And he wanted to ingratiate with himself with my mother, who wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he bought her a banana. So she looked at this thing. She had never seen one before in her life. And he says, SS Rachele, SS Rachele. So my mother started to eat it with the peel on. I'm sure you've heard that told by a lot of people. But I remember my mother telling me this when I was a little girl. You always have to peel a banana. She told me why.
I have my favorite grandma story from when she was growing up. She said that one year during the Seder, they were poor.
Oh, in Europe, yeah.
Back in Europe, they opened the door of their little shtetl house for Eliyahu Hanovi, and the goat came in.
See, they had a lean-to up against the house. They lived. My grandmother used to tell me they lived along. It was a farm they had there. Then my grandmother grew a lot of the produce that they ate, which they would store in the basement. And there was a stream running beside the house. So in the spring, the ice would break, and they'd go out there, my grandmother said, and catch fish with their hands. It was so plentiful, they'd actually pick the fish up and catch it and bring it in. They had a lean-to against the house, and they had a goat. And in the spring, a kid was born, and this is the kid that jumped on the table when Eliyahu Hanavi would come
I
over
just
the door.
remember that he walked in. I didn't know he
Yeah,
jumped on the
it
table.
was a goat and jumped on top of the table. And
Well, every year, whenever I open the door for Eliyahu Hanovi, I think of Grandma.
Yeah,
and the goat. Well, she said that her shtetl looked like the shtetl in
the fiddler.
Fiddler on the Roof. When she saw the movie, she said, I was there. That's where I grew up.
That's right. And my grandmother told, my grandmother both told me that when Easter time would come around and the Russian Easter would come, there was still ice on the rivers. And the Russians would carve a huge cross out of the ice and stand it up. And the priests would spill beet juice on it, which was the blood of Jesus, which the Jews had drawn. And they'd say, go after the Zhids. And that's when they'd have a lot of the pogroms at that time. So the Jews would all run and hide in their basements. And it was a very, very difficult time. She had cousins who lived in the Fabermans, who lived in a smaller shtetl than theirs even, and they would come running to hide in the basement of my grandparents' house. It was a very difficult life for them. By the way, my father came to America through Helsinki, and he said it was in the summertime, and he said, the sun never set, and they couldn't imagine, why isn't the sun setting? When's it going to set? He said they stayed up all night long waiting for the dark to come upon them. You know, the sun does set, it just gets grayish. And it never did, and he said it was, to him it was a phenomenon to see that, you know.
Do you know what ship he came over on?
No, I don't know, but I do know he came by way of Helsinki.
Mama had an aunt here in Houston.
Celia.
Celia. Talk about Celia too?
Well, yeah, my grandmother had a sister. Well, there were a lot of relatives on my...
How about there's an aunt?
on my mother's side, on my grandmother's side, one of them was her sister Celia. She was the youngest of her siblings. She lived in Chicago. And she had one son, Henry Bleckman. And Henry now lives in Texas, and he has 3 children. They live in the Houston area. Henry, I think, lives now in Temple, Texas. And his children live in Houston, Texas. My mother's first cousin was Joseph Henkin, and Joseph Henkin was the son of my grandmother's brother. And Joe's had a son, Morris Henkin. who lived in Chicago.
Brother.
A brother, I mean, a brother. Morris Hankin, who married, and he married Mary, and they had a son, Robert, for whom I babysat once and fell asleep when she couldn't get back into the house. She had to get a janitor to open the window to let her into the house. He had to climb the fire escape in the apartment. Huh?
When he lived on aviation.
Yeah. They never let me forget it. What a babysitter I was. I was totally good. I was 14 years old and I felt, I wouldn't have heard of anybody, anybody came through.
Tell me about the time you and Mildred were babysitting me.
I don't even want to talk about that one.
I know, now I think you have to.
I guess I'll have to. Harold was about 4 or 5 years old.
I was about 7.
You were 7?
7 or 8, yeah.
7 or 8. And we lived on 69th Street at that time. It was on a Saturday night. My mother and father went shopping because a lot of the stores in that area were closed during the day on Saturday. And they went shopping, and Mildred and I were taking care of this paragon of virtue, my brother Harold, the baby, and the next thing we know, he got a little rambunctious and we started to have a fight, so he locked us out of the house. So when my mother and father came home, there was the baby who we were taking care of upstairs in the house all by himself.
I was sleeping and they were sitting outside.
And the two of us were sitting outside crying because why it was Harold locked us out of the house.
They started to match me. I kicked him out of the house, locked the door. That's all.
What happened to Grandma and her family when they came over?
Well, my grandfather was a foreman in a dressmaker district in
In a short-break
no, I think they said
Sweatshop.
in a sweatshop, literally. And my mother was 12 years old, and they didn't have any money. They were terribly poor. And my mother was put out to work. And what did she do? She was a nursemaid for a baby. She had to wash diapers, take care of the baby, do everything around that. She was literally a slave there. And I think they paid her 25 cents a week. She wanted to take piano lessons so badly she could taste it. And they couldn't afford it. Piano lessons for 25 cents a lesson. They didn't have the 25 cents for the lesson. And I think that's one of the reasons my sister took lessons. As soon as my parents could afford to buy a piano, they gave Mildred piano lessons, and they taught me the mandolin. They wanted Harold to take the piano lessons, but he only wanted to play the drums, so they said, no drums, there's no piano. That was the end of Harold's musical education. He was always a musical duck. But he used to get up early in the morning before his eyes opened. He was singing, Little David, play on your harp. That's when David was born, we knew he'd be named David. There was no doubt of it in our minds. But the song was there before he got on his way to the bathroom.
Was your house an apartment or a single-family house?
We had a double family, what they called a two-family house. It was a semi-detached house, and there were 2 flats. And our house, which was on the upper story of the house, which my parents owned at that time, had a living room, a very large dining room. In those days, they built the dining rooms larger than the living room. Next to the living room, there was a music room, and in the front of the living room, there was a sun parlor, which was a very pretty room where we had wicker furniture. And then up in the front of the house, there was a bedroom that my dear brother had all to himself, lucky guy. Then there was a...
He used to spy on the girls.
Anyway, Mildred didn't Sam when they were making out. Anyway, as you walk from the sun parlor to the living room, the dining room, you come into a breakfast room, a very nice sized breakfast room. It's probably the size of Vicky's dining area here now, where she has her next to the kitchen. And a kitchen, hall, and 2 other bedrooms, but only 1 bathroom. And it was on the 2nd floor. There was a front entrance and a side entrance to the house. And there was
may I take a picture, Gail?
and there was also a garage and a driveway leading up to the garage.
I think you're being upstage.
I think I'm being upstage.
Mommy's using it right now.
Anyway, my father had an assortment of Ifshin cousins. One was Morris Ifshin, who married and had 4 children. 3 boys and a girl. The girl unfortunately died when she was very young. And then he had another cousin, Ifshin, but they spelled their names I-F-S-H-E-I-N. He had a daughter, Fanny, and a son, Arthur. And Arthur had, Arthur is married and living in Brooklyn, I know. Then there is, my father had another uncle that was my Uncle Izzy's brother